Welcome to Beyond the Design, the podcast where we explore the artistry, creativity, and stories behind the world of design. I'm your host, Craig Montflin, and today we're stepping beyond interiors into the great outdoors. And let's face it, a stunning landscape can be just as captivating as a beautifully designed home. Our guest today is Adam Kober, a visionary landscape architect who has spent the past 2 decades designing jaw-dropping outdoor spaces. Well, Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, let's just let's just start right into it. You have an incredible eye for landscape design. Was there a moment in your life when you knew exactly that this was meant for you to do?
I don't know that there was an exact moment. I even have moments where I'm still, should I be doing this?
What do I do? Should I be doing it?
Right. I mean, is it, on what world am I doing this, or should I be doing this? But, I'm from Indiana. I grew up on a farm, small town. I think there were 50 people in my high school graduating class. And for me, I was always artistic. And so I was always drawing. I was always doodling. And by the time I graduated high school, I knew that I had some artistic talent. But I was terrified of being a starving artist. And I was not sure how to get both of those to work together.
Right.
And so being in Indiana, decided I knew I wanted to go to a state school. And so I went to Purdue. And I entered Purdue as an undecided, undeclared major. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And so started, and within that first semester, I had been talking to, counselors and things, and they had mentioned architecture, but Purdue didn't have a school of architecture, but they had a school of landscape architecture, which was in their school of agriculture. And I had never even heard of landscape architecture. So I started doing some research and started talking to various professors, and they even gave me some numbers of landscape architects, local and some like down in Indianapolis. And I called, and I was pretty blunt and, asked about, what their work life was like. Right. And I was pretty pointed in, do you feel like you make a comfortable living? And they were pretty honest, and it allowed me to finally decide that, I wanted to pursue that. And so I did. And then it was, I think during Christmas break of my freshman year, one of my friends in college, his parents were going to Las Vegas, and he called me and he said, do you want to go with us? And so we all jumped on the plane, and we were in Las Vegas, I think between Christmas and New Year's. We were there for a few days, but Las Vegas, everything is just larger than life,
right.
in Las Vegas. And you're walking down that strip, and you're seeing all of these, these hotels and all the landscape that goes with it. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you're on the strip, there's a huge amount of property between where you're standing on the Las Vegas Strip and, those buildings, and all of that's landscape.
Exactly.
And it was one of those epiphany moments where I'm like, oh, this is landscape, and this is landscape at a different level. This is not like doing your mom and pop, shop or your, or a home, that I was used to in Indiana. It was just a different deal. And it was kind of within that span of a few months that I started to really see some opportunity, in an area that I hadn't even thought about. And so that's kind of really how it started, how my, path started in landscape, quite frankly.
But it's funny that you go to Las Vegas, where it's just the most unlandscaped, except for the hospitality industry. Mm-hmm. Everything is very desert oriented, and it's not very green and lush. So to have that epiphany at that most, I think, opposite end.
And I do remember, and then one of the things about me with landscape is that it's not just plants. I'm wildly attracted to and very involved in the creation of the hardscape that goes into these landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the hardscape really that, really caught my eye. And, the amount of detail that went into not just the sidewalks and the paving and the sculpture and the fountains. Yes, there's beautiful plants, there's, palm trees and, all the different ornamental softscape that you see in Las Vegas along that strip area.
Right.
But it was really the hardscape too that I was like, oh, I can really sink my teeth into the design of this stuff.
Yeah, because it brings the experiential environments together.
Right.
It is an experience with all the various components. Well, you've designed landscapes for some of the most famous hospitality and entertainment venues in the world. What was your very first break in the industry?
I think where I felt like I was starting to be taken serious as a designer was when I started to do my work at Rockefeller Center. There's the Channel Gardens, which are the gardens between, Fifth Avenue
Mm-hmm.
and the famous ice skating rink.
Right.
And it's always, it's that long shot, that corridor shot with the angels, that you can see the Christmas
Right.
tree. And, that's where everyone wants to stand, when they visit
That's their
New
selfie
York
moment.
for the first time. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so, the Channel Gardens is a concept that was there for the Rockefeller design, the whole complex of buildings since the 1930s, when they built everything. And the idea for that garden, it's a series of 3 fountains, 3 pools cascading down. And, you can walk in between them, but you can walk along the side of them. There's seating. And it's always been the idea is a thematic garden. So when I was tasked with, to do a calendar year's worth of gardens. So we decided we were going to do 10 different designs in 1 year. And so they took me into kind of the underground area, one of these deep rooms under in the big 30 Rock building.
Right.
And they've started pulling out all of these photo albums of designs of that garden from like the 1950s and then the 1960s and the 1970s. And it was just, they were elaborate and it was just incredible. And so then, then for them to allow me to have my influence on that space for a period of time, I feel like that's when I started to get some confidence, and I feel like that's when people started to look at me a little differently as a designer. And so I think that's probably when I feel like, if I had a break, I would say, when I started to enter that world.
Well, Rockefeller Center is a significant, definitely a significant project. I would say so.
Yeah.
You made it in the Big Apple,
Well, yeah. So, and then, to be able to do, I think there was 2 more years after that and, just keep going. It's just, anytime I'm able to work on a history or a project that has history like that, a landmark, so like Rockefeller Center or, I put the Fort Worth Stockyards in there, where it's just, there's so much history wrapped up in those spaces and, they're protected. And then when somebody allows me to have, the tiniest little bit of, influence on that space or within a certain amount of time for that space, I just always really consider it an honor. And so I just, those are big things for me.
Well, you're part of history now, because when someone 40 years from now opens that book and the photograph, there you're going to be. So congratulations.
hopefully it's not one where they're like, don't ever do that.
This is the do not do side.
This is exactly right.
Well, I think a lot of people don't understand landscape architecture and design. They think it's certain elements where it's actually, you can say it's the cherry on the cake. It's the finishing touch. It brings everything together because you don't arrive to a space inside or exterior unless you have the architecture of the landscape and design a lot of people do think landscaping is just as plants and trees, but your work goes far beyond that with custom fountains, intricate metalwork, and glass mosaics. How do you approach a project holistically?
I think for me, it's just there's a method to the madness. Um,
Is there?
I mean,
That's a secret sauce question.
there's a little bit, there is a little bit of a science to it for me, just as I have to do it that way. But I always look at what are the natural characteristics of, the setting itself, like the natural topography, the natural climate. What are the species of plants that you see growing naturally around there? A lot of what I do is reactionary. It's reactionary to, the natural elements of the weather, the climate, the topography. It's reactionary to if an architect has already been on the project. I have to react to what they're doing with their architecture.
Right.
And it's the same with the interiors. I want to react to what the interior designer is thinking with their scheme for the inside. And then I feel like my job then is to accentuate all of that and to help pull it together so that, I can take the natural topography and help that architecture feel like it's not been plopped down onto the land, but nestled into the land. And then the same with the interior. I want so many people, and I'm a big fan of this too. They want that indoor outdoor
Right.
seamless connection. So it's not uncommon for me to look at a landscape or look at a project and see the footprint of the building and say, okay, I hope you all understand there is a tremendous view out this direction of the building. I want to blow this whole wall out. And some architects are like, what are you talking about? You're insane. And but when you have a good team with you, and everyone kind of checks their egos at the door, you can have those conversations, and we can do a lot of those things. So that's how I start to look at it. It's just I react to a lot of different things, but once you start seeing all of those pieces, the design really starts to form itself. And then once you bring in the influence of the owner and what their ideas and their wish list and what they also kind of their requirements of how they need the space to work.
Correct.
I mean,
right.
the design really starts to flesh itself out.
It's very true is that connectivity, I think, all has to come together and play its part, but also be married in a way that makes sense so that experiential environment is consistent from indoor, outdoor, the building and its surroundings.
Right. I mean, you never want to be the guy who couldn't play well in the sandbox with the others.
Right.
You have to make it all feel like it all works together.
Right.
As a site. So,
if you could create a dream landscape anywhere in the world, no matter budget, no budget limits, no rules, no parameters, where would it be and what would it look like?
Truthfully, I don't know if I have a spot on the planet. I like formal design. I like and I like symmetry.
Formal
I like symmetry.
Essence and classical design?
Both. It can be, I can both in, but I do feel like I do tend to lean a little more classic, a little more traditional. I do like infusing contemporary nods, contemporary, little nuances here and there. Right. So, but I do feel like I tend to lean more classic. So I like lots of structure. I like lots of symmetry. I like lots of clean cut lines. So when you start introducing hedges or trees that are clipped, pollarded, things like that, that starts to turn my crank, a little bit. I like very intricate carvings. I love to design carved elements like carved fountains, carved sculptures.
Mm-hmm.
I love to do tile patterns, really ornate paving. I love to do the intricate tile in a pool. And I have a client who, he kind of gives me a hard time, and he was like, "You're always really good at adding the frosting." And he just he was like,
cherry on the top.
if there's one thing I know you know how to do well, it's adding the frosting. And so, and I sometimes I know, less is more, and then sometimes more is more. But
Exactly. Yeah.
I do tend to lean naturally a little more into the classic design. So you go French. I'd probably be a pretty strong candidate for wanting a French garden.
Which brings me to a question that just popped in my head. Of all the classical gardens in the world, is there one in particular that really stands out to you? Is like that's a Adam Kober dream?
I mean, and I hate to say it, just sounds so cliche, but I mean, when visiting Versailles, I mean, you just can't, the enormity of the grounds. I mean, it's a classic. And I hate to sound so like, yeah, everybody says that, but it truly is overwhelming. And it's one of those things where I think about little things, that I, absorbed when walking through there for the first time, and there are little pieces that I take even now, because one of the things about that whole property is that it's so massive that yes, there are lots of spaces that you can see right from the beginning, and you can see the enormity of how big it is, how grand it is. But there's also lots of more intimate spaces, and where the pathways contract. And it's something that's an element that I try to infuse into a lot of my designs. This expansion contraction, because I think it helps build trauma. It helps build anticipation for, what's around the bend or what's through this little corridor, and it also, this sense of discovery is something that I think is incredibly important as you maneuver through a garden. And that's definitely in Versailles. I mean, as you go into all those various little spaces, that you wouldn't think would be there, then suddenly there's this fountain and it might be a small little fountain, but it's just something that's, and so, I think, that's one of those that's made a big impact on me, and still does. And I still infuse some of those, design elements that I see there in some of my work now.
Especially the experience, depending on the season at Versailles, it's always something different and something new. It's, even though it's a classical information, there's always a different experience depending on the season.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, that's one of the interesting things about my work is that, like you said, it changes. I'm working with material that changes from season to season, also has a lifespan, also changes throughout its life because it grows. And so, it's a little bit of that's a challenge sometimes, because, I often say, when clients get frustrated with a plant that, gets big over, 5 or 10 years, I'm like, you have to understand, this isn't a piece of tile. It's, we're not dealing with something that it's going to stay, that's going to remain constant. And so that's just part of it. And it's part of maintenance. It's part of the life. But I think that's one of the great things about a garden is that, they always say it's living. Yeah, it is living. It's evolving. It's changing. The colors change, the sizes change, the textures change, all of it. And so as long as, you're open to that, I mean, there's always something different to be had, moment by moment, day by day, month by month. So,
what's the oddest or most unexpected inspiration you've ever used for landscape design?
It's, I get inspiration from lots of different things. And I'm a big fan of the architect Thomas Heatherwick in London,
Mm-hmm.
and he uses lots of curves and lots of fluid forms, and I am always intrigued by forms that look like they have movement, but yet they're made of metal. So it's something that you can't, you wouldn't think to bend, but it's bending, or it looks like it's bending, and it looks like it's creating this movement. And so there's a store in Soho in New York. It's the Longchamp store, and they created this staircase that goes from like stair steps, and then goes up the wall, and then goes up to the second level of stairs up, and then goes up again. And I just found that so intriguing, and I ended up using that idea for a massive garden in EU China, as a way to create, because
cool.
EU is kind of the center of where they do lots of textiles and fashion and fabrics and things. A lot of that comes out of that area of China. And so the idea was, I wanted to create something that seemed like it had a connection to fabric. And so I used that as kind of this idea of ribbon, ribbon running through the garden. And so I was able to create these terraces, and that, went from the ground plane up, walls, and then, would go over the walls, and then go up again. And so it's weird how a shop, that sells purses and, leather and, that kind of goods in New York can suddenly, and it's just a stairway, can suddenly be the inspiration for a massive garden, on the other side of the world. So, I think that's one of my weirder, inspirations.
I wouldn't say weirder. I say very creative and inspirational.
Yeah. But it's I just remember having that moment of like, stopping and just, having to take this in. And, the people that I was with, they're like keeping walking. They're like, what are you looking at? I'm like, look at this glorious staircase. So, but, I took lots of pictures of it, and I ended up, using it for a garden design in China.
Hey, why not? Well, your firm, Cobra Design Group, has had incredible success since launching in 2021. What was the biggest challenge and most exciting part of starting your own firm?
I think it was terribly, terribly anxiety provoking. Working at another firm that was really well known prior, and having some decent wins under my belt, and then I knew that at some point I wanted to be in the driver's seat. I wanted to be in the driver's seat not only of the way I evolved as a designer, but kind of as the projects that I worked on in my career, and the way I started just to do business with that kind of stuff. And I knew that really the best way to be in control of that was to own my own firm. And so I got lucky. I had been talking with friends about the possibility of starting my own company for a while, and there was always apprehension. And I'm risk averse. I'm not someone who likes to
leap of faith.
I exactly. It's one of those things where I have to really, really, really analyze it. And fortunately, just an opportunity came around that could not be passed up, and was a perfect jumping off point for it to start a company. And the people with the project knew my situation, knew I was at another firm, and they said, if you'll take the leap, we would love to have you. And it was just like, it was one of those things where my former employer, my mentor, Don Brinkerhoff, I could just hear him saying, "You're an idiot if you don't take this." I could just hear him saying, this kind of thing doesn't happen often,
Right.
and
Right.
you're an idiot if you think it will. So go for it.
When
And
it comes to,
I could just hear him saying that, and so that's how it kind of worked.
yeah, sometimes when that plate comes into you, you got to take it and say yes.
Right. And it was one of those things where it was a great project. I still have the project. They're great clients. And, there was everyone knew the situation from the beginning. It wasn't like I wasn't pretending like I already had this company. I wasn't pretending like I, had, already the staff in place and all of this stuff. This client, they knew the situation. They knew that I wanted to start my own firm, but there was just some apprehension on my part. They understood that, and they were incredibly gracious about the whole thing. And I am so grateful to them. And they've been great clients.
That's
And so
fantastic.
it just really all worked out.
Well, we talked about seasonal in the effects of landscape architecture and design, and landscaping can be deeply tied to a region's climate, culture, and history. How do you balance creativity with practical realities of weather, maintenance, and functionality?
That's a great question. It can be very challenging. I have a current project. I work with the Fort Worth Stockyards, with Majestic Realty and Heritage, the Heritage Group down there. And, there is a lot of history, with that site. It is very much when people want to see cowboys, when people want to see pieces of the Old West,
Right.
When they visit Texas, everyone eventually ends up at the Stockyards. And there is a huge history there, over 100 years of, the cowboy heritage part of it, but also, the meat packing, industry that, played, that was such a piece of that. And so you have the component of something that's got the history, that's got the protection. It's a historic site, so you've got that to contend with. Guest expectations of what they're going to see. And then Texas is a very tough spot because it is incredibly hot in the summer and incredibly cold in the winter, and particularly in Fort Worth. And so it's a tough place to get plants that are bulletproof. Bulletproof as far as climate, bulletproof as far as water usage, bulletproof as far as guest experience. It's when you're in an exterior environment like that, those plants just can kind of take a beating. When people are sitting on benches and they have a backpack on, and they don't realize that their backpack is on, and every time they move, they're busting up the plant behind them.
Right.
And so those, it's interesting. You just have to start finding plants, and you start finding materials that can withstand a lot of that. And it doesn't always work, and it doesn't always last, but you kind of start to figure out and weed through what you see does work, what can stand up to those things. And you just start to use that kind of material more often.
Is it a lot of trial and error, or is it a lot of research and other means to really find out what's going to take the beating, I guess?
A little bit of both. I mean, truthfully, I think, in that particular case, in that, for that venue, we have had a lot of material that we started out with one plant palette. And as the years have kind of gone through, we've realized, while we liked the look of certain plant material, it's just not holding up. And so we'll do little tweaks here and there and, finesse it so that we eventually can, get to a spot where it's holding up from a guest perspective, but also holding up from a weather perspective. Those sometimes Texas can get some of those quick, sudden cold snaps, and it will freeze. And some of those things are just unavoidable. I mean, but that being said, you like I said, you have to understand its landscape. You have to understand it's not tile, and so you just have to give everything out there a little bit more grace. When you're dealing with that, and we do our best to direct the design of that, and you make sure it's as successful as possible. But our happiest clients are the ones who understand. That's the beauty of this, though. It is an evolving a piece of their property, and so that's just part of it.
True. Well, you've been lucky and you've worked on some massive entertainment spaces, hotels, and even mixed-use developments. How do you approach designing for spaces that need to wow thousands of people daily? Give it a punch, wow factor.
Right. And so, it's the funny thing about Las Vegas. I worked for, a firm for 16 years, 17 years. And, I talked about, visiting Vegas when I was a freshman in college and the impact that made on me, earlier. And then later I happened to, get connected with the firm that was doing a lot of the hotels along the Las Vegas Strip. And so I went in, met the owner, and, they hired me, a couple of weeks later. But one of the biggest lessons from that I took away from working there was, you have the guest experience. You have what, people just expect, from a landscape. They just expect trees and shrubs and whatever. But in Las Vegas, everything has to be on, to the next level. And then not the next level, the next of the next level. And you always just have to. And so one of the things that I try to infuse in my projects, and I try to make sure is understood, is that I think when designing a landscape, you need to allow some time. You need to allow some time to let things marinate and let things evolve. And, yes, I can, draw, and we can get a design out, very quickly. And sometimes that's what clients want. They want it, and they want it fast, and they don't want it, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. And, that's what it is. But I do think there is merit in allowing people and your design team to process, because I think it allows everyone, including the ownership, to watch the design evolve and watch, things unfold that they didn't even necessarily think about in the beginning, that, are starting to come out, and they see the pros, and even some of the cons, like, oh, this is starting to happen, and we want to make sure we don't go down that route. Or this is starting to happen. I didn't expect that, but wow, let's, how can we, amp this up and get more out of this? And so one of the things that I try to make sure everyone understands is that I think you shouldn't rush. I'm not one to say, sit, and let it become stagnant. But I am one to say, don't go too fast. You got to let things evolve. And fortunately, architecture, at that kind of scale, when you're doing large hotels, large, mixed use, those things take a while. And so for me, the landscape naturally kind of has a timeline that has to follow that. And so that is already kind of built in. And I typically don't have to talk too much about, let it set, let's marinate for a little bit. Because that's just part of, being reactionary to what the other designers are doing. True. But that's one thing that I think is important, that people they don't like to talk about letting things, have a little bit of space, have a little bit of breathing room, because they're always worried about time is money. And I get it. But I do think, and there are so many designers or so many clients who are worried about changes. And I tend to say it's not necessarily about a change. It's about evolving. It's about letting things evolve and, get to where they need to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you allow the project that time and space, if you allow your designers that time and space, I think you're probably going to get to a better product than if you just, forced it to be finished quickly.
True. I think one of the things with hospitality projects, because once those keys are turned over, it's in operation mode in day one.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the developers, they don't want to wait 5 years for that tree to be 10 feet tall. They want the tree to be 10 feet tall on day one.
Exactly.
Has there been, since you probably hand select and transplant fully mature trees for your projects, sometimes from hundreds of miles away, what's the most challenging or rewarding tree move you've ever done?
I mean, that's the thing about hospitality is, there's only one opening day. There's only one shot to make a first impression.
Yep.
And we always push for the biggest plant material that we can get, because you want to make it look like everything's been there from the beginning, for a very long time, and this hotel just happens to be nestled in this beautiful, garden. And that's the thing, is when you buy plant material that's large, you're buying time. It's instant gratification. And that's what, most developers want. Mm-hmm. In Texas, particularly at the stockyards, we transplanted, I would guess 30 to 40 fully mature oak trees, from, all over parts of Texas. When you're traveling hundreds of miles away, you're kind of limited to what you can get down the road. Like you can take about a 40-foot tall by 40-foot wide tree is about the max that you can get down the road. That's saying, these trees all have to be vetted, so you have to go in, you have to look at the branching structure. Then you have to have an arborist go in and look at the branching structure, because what we do is then find the tree, and then have you ever seen those little troll dolls with the hair?
Oh, yeah. You shake them up.
Right, exactly. Right. And so that's basically what we do to these oak trees is, how you take those troll dolls and you kind of do this and and all their hair kind of goes up. And that's exactly what we do with these oak trees, or, any tree, of size that you have to get down the road. So we start from the bottom and pull all those limbs up and kind of, do like you do the troll doll hair, and kind of, so it's all pulled up and collapsed and then laid down on a flatbed. And most of trees like that, you can only do about one tree per, semi truck. And then, so a lot of those have a root ball system that has, it's usually about 12 feet by 12 feet is about the max, by about 34 to 44 inches in depth. And then they lay those down on the flatbeds, and then you have to support the trunk, because there's a lot of weight there. And then, we'll ship those. So those can be an undertaking, because those all require permits to go through, all those small towns in Texas. They all require pilot cars. So those are big undertakings. And even things like, I remember going out on a hillside here down in San Diego County, California, and looking at a bunch of cactus, material, and hand selecting all of this cactus material that nobody would have ever seen. And I just happened to be in this nursery, and I asked the guy, will you drive your truck over there? And he was like, oh, we don't have anything over there. And I was like, can we just go look? And like 3 weeks later, it's being installed in Rockefeller Center. and I had handpicked these like barrel cactus, and made this garden where it was just all these clumps of barrel cactus, and so things like that where you didn't expect something like that because it was basically someone thought it was junk.
Right.
And then you go and you put it, and it's like in the, like right in the middle of Manhattan. So those things are some of my most rewarding, from the big to just the unexpected.
What's the most high maintenance plants you've ever worked with?
I think it's not necessarily one plant. The grain walls are a really big thing, that a lot of people are starting to implement. Mm-hmm. And I find them to be temperamental. I find them to require a lot of maintenance and a lot of care and upkeep. You have to get the right combination of plants. And it's always, that's one where it's trial and error. It's just, because you just never know in an exterior environment how those walls are going to react. And because you can think it's, in a bulletproof spot, and there'll be gusts of wind that you didn't anticipate, or, things. And so I think it's not necessarily a plant per se that I think is difficult, but I will say configuring plants in those walls, I think can sometimes be challenging.
Yeah, why is it factor? Is it a trend right now? Because a lot of projects, from my perspective, have been asked. It's like, oh, those are a pain. Those are a pain because the filtration system, the water system. If it's indoors, it's all the interior architecture and support infrastructure.
Yeah, it's like, I think there's more success with the ones that are on the inside, because I think you can control the environment a little more. It's just, it's climate controlled. You can control the wind, all of these things. Whereas when you're in an exterior environment, it's just a bunch of added layers that, can make things more challenging. I do feel that, I've had a project where we had this gigantic wall, and the clients wanted to treat it like it was a piece of their art collection. So they, there were certain Warhols, that they had, that they were like, is there any way that we can get a floral version of this, into our wall? And so, taking inspiration from, the Damien Hirsts and the Mark Quinns and, the Warhols, and then trying to, get that to work in a floral pattern that's, vertical, is challenging. And, it's interesting, and it keeps, I think when it does work, it's fantastic and everyone loves it. But I think those are challenging.
When it goes wrong, it goes usually really wrong.
and it goes wrong fast. And the problem is it can go wrong just in one little spot of the wall. And so then, it's just so, if you got a maintenance team and they can do it, that's great. But you have to, especially with hospitality, because you can't just have a little piece of the wall go down. You always have to make sure that you've got replacement material. So you've always got to have stuff on deck. You've got to have stuff in the back, that you can replace. So I just find that the grain walls, the vertical, walls, are something that's challenging.
Speaking of trends with social media and television and all sorts of other avenues, trends seem to be populated globally more quickly than ever before. What's the biggest trend in landscaping design right now that excites you?
I don't know that there's one trend. I will say, and this is just me, I'm slow with trends. Because I'm always worried that I don't want a landscape to ever look like, oh, that was 2021, wasn't it, when you did that? And so I don't feel. I try to be careful with trends. One that I do think that is gaining traction and that I do like is a lot of people are starting to use pea gravel for top dressing. Instead of doing the typical bark mulch, people are starting to do. There's lots of variations of pea gravel, lots of variations of decorative rock, and I think that people are starting to use that in lieu of bark mulch. And that's also becoming important because of, with all of these latest wildfires that we've had in California, the fuel modification, the fire prevention,
Right.
all of that is really at the forefront of everyone's minds right now as they rebuild the Palisades and rebuild all of those communities that were lost. And so you have a lot of fire authorities that are coming in and saying, so many feet, or there are certain zones, 5 feet from the face of the building, or 30 feet from the face of the building, or 100 feet from the face of the building. You can only have XYZ material.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those trends is, with using the pea gravel, I think is also going to help in that effort. Because bark mulch is incredibly it will catch fire very, very quickly.
Oh, yeah.
But I think when people are starting to use the pea gravel, I think that's something. It's got a little bit more of a contemporary edge to it. As I should back that up. That's not necessarily true. It's just the way in which you design or plan to use it. But I think that's a trend that is gonna keep going and getting more popular. And I think a lot of it will have to do with some of these requirements that are put in place by the fire marshals.
I think, wasn't pea gravel very used a lot during the 60s?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's been used, and it's been used all throughout Europe. I mean, even in all those those famous palaces, there's pea gravel everywhere. And but now you can get all the different sizes, all the different colors, and there's lots of variation. And so I like to play with different colors, different sizes of decorative rock, in some of our gardens, so, but I do think that's a trend that's going to keep, gaining momentum.
Mm-hmm. If you had to be stranded in a garden forever, what 3 plants or trees would you want to be around you?
I think I love a good boxwood. I love a good boxwood. I think they're tried and true, and keep things. I like structure, so it's like even if you had, you can take a hedge and it can be messy in the middle. If you box out,
Right.
had a hedge, that was done at square, it can be messy in the middle, but as long as you're tailored around the edges, I'm good. So I would say boxwood. I do. I'm always a big fan of hydrangeas. I think you've got a great pop of color. And I'm going to give you 2 more. I like coral trees. Coral trees they can be. I think some people they can be a little polarizing because the larger coral trees can have a weak branching structure,
Right.
and so I know some people have issues with them because of that. But I like their branching structure, and I think that there's a sculptural quality about it. And not only do I find them interesting in the day, but I find that when lit properly, they can be really fantastic at night and cast really great shadows, on what would be maybe a somewhat boring facade. And so I know people might be rolling their eyes a little bit about that, but I like the coral trees because of their branching structure.
Did you have one more?
And here's another one people will probably roll their eyes at. I never get tired of saying the fuchsia in bougainvillea.
Really?
Anytime I see that color, it excites me. So yeah, I'm a big one for that.
I like the orange, the
Oh, do you?
deeper. Oh,
Yeah.
that's my favorite.
Yeah. So I mean, that color, even that color behind you, when you can get that, I'll put that in a garden all day long.
All right. Well, if you're designing a bucket list backyard for yourself, what's in it? A pool, fire pit, outdoor theater? What's Adam's dream bucket list backyard?
It's I want a big body of water. So if I could do a pond or a lake, if I can do a dancing fountain in it with music, I'll do a dancing fountain with music. Pool for sure, spa, fireplace, outdoor fireplace, some kind of shade structure. And I, any of the bells and whistles of like a fitness garden, where you can do like, you can incorporate the yoga and the stretching lawn, or the cold plunge pool, or things like that. Things like that. I like when you can use the exterior as part of your fitness regime. And so, anytime I can incorporate that, with, fitness, I would do that.
I like the cold plunge pool idea.
Yeah. It's not so fun when you're doing it.
No. I've always wanted a Japanese soaking tub, because they're round and you actually soak into it.
Right. Exactly.
What's one plant people should never put in their yard, no matter what, or how tempting?
Personal preference here, I hate eucalyptus trees.
Yeah.
I think eucalyptus trees are equivalent to a weed. It's one of those things where
I don't think we have many Australians listening. So,
it's just here in California, we see them all along the freeways. We see them along the parking structures, and I understand they have a purpose because they grow fast and they grow tall. But from the perspective of designing a garden or designing, something, that I think has a little bit more of an elevated feel, I never see a eucalyptus being part of that. And so somebody asked me a question about this, or a similar question a few months ago, and they actually wanted to know my thought on eucalyptus trees, and I said, never use it. So they have their purpose, but for my designs, for what I do, it's just one of those that I stay away from.
And you can't plant anything underneath them, correct? Because of the sap?
Well, something? and that's the other thing is that, because of the sap and the resin, makes them highly flammable. So that's another thing that they're becoming, they're starting to be on these lists of do not use because of the resin that's in it. So, it's just one of those that I just kind of steer away from.
If someone wants to refresh their backyard but doesn't have a huge budget, what's one high impact change they can make?
Again, I would go back to the pea gravel. I would, if there were something that you could do that were not terribly expensive, I would, if you can afford to change out or even install some edging, if you can do the stone edging, the little stone blocks that are like 2 inches wide by 6 inches long, 12 inches long, 6 inches deep. I think that's always a nice touch. If you want to upgrade from like steel edging or aluminum edging, and then the other thing is changing out all of your shredded bark mulch to a pea gravel. And I'm not saying you have to do that everywhere. I think, if you want to do that in just certain key spots, I think it's a great way to highlight, pockets of your garden. If there's, a certain clumping of plants that, look better because you see their leaf structure better because it's got something that's lighter underneath it. Right. I think, do that. You don't have to do it everywhere, But those are little things that I think, don't break the bank if you wanted to do it just a quick facelift.
What's next for Cobra Design Group? Any exciting projects coming up that you can share?
We have lots of exciting projects coming up. I really, unfortunately, I can't share, but we
it's
are
just between me and you.
I've heard.
Yeah.
No. It's we have lots of exciting projects coming up. And the growth is continuing at a very great and steady pace that I'm very excited about. I not a lot of projects that I can tell anyone about just yet, but we're moving up when we're very, very, very excited.
If there's one project you'd like to do, any type of sector that you haven't done yet, what would it be?
It's funny. I have never done, being so close to Los Angeles, I have never done like a set. And it's so interesting because I feel like so much of what we do or what my company does or with hospitality, where it's just an instant gratification, that translates to, a movie set. And I it's something that I've never done before, but I think that's something that would be interesting to do, to to work on, a set like The Crown, or something that had something a big grand scale exterior environment that would be filmed in. I think that would be fascinating.
Amusement park?
I worked on a park, and it was very fascinating. It's crazy the amount of trees that goes into those. And I remember I did a design, and I think it was roughly around 80 acres. And by the time I was finished, it took me a very, very long time to design it. It was a big park down in Mexico, and there were over, I think, 10,000 trees when I was finished. And and you don't think about it, but like when you're driving into Disneyland or when you're driving into any of these theme parks, you're driving down these long corridors that are tree lined, and they use all of these trees to frame the rooms. So because beyond those trees, 20 or 30 feet back, are the rides, the attractions, and so they use those as the way to build those spaces in the park. And so it's amazing the amount of trees that you go through when you build a park like that.
So what's been surprising to you as you started this journey of being on your own and having your own firm that you're most surprised about and challenged you?
I think what I'm most surprised about is I think I've been surprised at how much work it takes to run a business versus, I've always been, for the better part of my career, I've been allowed to just be a designer. And then, when I decided to go out on my own, it's not only you have to be a designer, but then you have to run a business.
Right.
and sometimes I'm not sure, there are lots of days where I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing, when it comes to that. I know what I'm doing when it comes to design, or, some days. but running a business has been a thing that has been, a very fascinating thing for me to learn. And I've had to learn how to adapt certain things. I've learned, how to wear that hat as well as wear the hat of the designer. I think that one of the challenging things for me is when I get into a design mode, that just create, where you're constantly creating, you're just churning, and you kind of get into this headspace where you have this wild creativity spilling out of everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it allows, that's when some of my best stuff, can come out. And being able to get into that space while also being a business owner and managing, employees, managing, managing the bookkeepers and managing the insurance and all of these things that, you have to have your hand in when you're running the business, while then also having to get back into that creative headspace, because that's what the customers are coming for. They're not coming for how great our books are kept. They're not coming because of, our employee benefits. They're coming because they want to see something that nobody else has.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's been one of the biggest surprises and challenges for me, is how to balance both of those worlds, but also make sure that my creativity still stays at a high, and doesn't drop, because otherwise then, I'm like everybody else. I'm trying to be at a certain level. I'm trying to exceed expectations. I'm trying to, over deliver. And so just being able to wear all of those hats has been, an interesting learning curve for me, to go through.
It's a lot of juggling.
It is. Yeah, for sure.
I don't think a lot of people understand, when you want to be an entrepreneur, what it really takes. I want to be my own boss. Well, you're going to have to wear many hats to be your own boss.
Right. And there are days when, everything is just working well and you're like, this is what it's supposed to be like.
Yeah.
And then there are days where it's like, what did I do? Why did I think, owning a business was a good idea? But fortunately, those days are very far and few between. But you're exactly right. It's just, when you're an entrepreneur, you got to buckle up, Buttercup. Because it's a different deal.
If you had to describe your design style as a cocktail, what would it be?
Probably something classic. I've said I try to stay away from trends, so I'd probably be a pretty straight classic vodka martini. Strong and pretty to the point. That's not to say there are probably some clients who say, no, you're like one of those Bloody Marys at a brunch, where it's got the cheeseburger and the hot dog hanging out of it.
A combination of everything. It looks good, tastes great.
There are probably some days and some clients that would probably say, no, Adam, you're probably more like that. But, if I had to say my design style, I typically try to go pretty classic. And so it'd probably be something like a vodka martini.
Olives?
Probably. Yeah, but no vermouth.
No vermouth. Oh, wow. Straight to the good stuff.
Exactly.
Well, exactly. Adam, any final thoughts or tips for listeners who want to bring a little landscape magic into their own lives?
I think someone said to me a long time ago, landscape it's living, it's breathing, it's moving. And, as long as you embrace that and you lean into that, there's it can bring so much joy to you. And, and that's the beauty of it. It's charm, and it's the fact that it evolves.
Mm-hmm.
And, and as long as you're okay with that, and you allow yourself to have that, that you can get so much out of landscape. So,
true.
while can be wildly unpredictable. I think that's the beauty of it. So
absolutely. Takes a life upon its own, but it's also
exactly.
part of who you are and your personality, incorporating that. And it, like I said before, it's experiential environments that kind of soothes you and makes you happy and is there for you when you need it.
Exactly. And, I think, I'm very, I love what I do, and it has evolved into something that I love more and more every day. And it is because it's because of that life that's in it.
Mhm. Well, Adam, this has been such a fascinating conversation, and your passion for creating outdoor spaces that captivate and engage is so inspiring. And it's been a pleasure to have you on our show today.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Much continued success to you and to your group.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You take care.
Have a nice day. Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Beyond the Design. Subscribe for more inspiring conversations to our YouTube channel. Follow us on social media for updates and behind-the-scenes content. See you next time.
Hi, you're listening to a Pod for Good Media Network podcast. We are a network that provides podcasting production services and a supportive community in which podcasters can thrive. If you're a podcaster local in the Tulsa area, we would love to have your show on the network. If you are interested in starting one, we would love to help you get started. Find us online at podforgoodmedia.com and fill out our Pod With Us form. Happy podcasting.